You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
Hi, everyone. This is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for August 24th, 2018. This week I'm talking about salt intake, prices of drugs, Takotsubo syndrome, a new data on low carbohydrate diets, and an ESC preview. The first topic is about salt and salt restriction. And I'll start by saying that distraction is one of the greatest impediments to achieving health. This is why doctors and patients should be concerned about sodium recommendations and, I'll say, the great salt wars among experts. So the AHA and WHO recommend restricting sodium intake to less than 2 grams per day or thereabouts. And scant few individuals and surely no community can achieve such strict restriction. Now, the potential problems with sodium restriction here are twofold. One is that patients with heart disease spend a lot of energy and they forego enjoyment of food when they restrict their sodium. But perhaps this energy would be better spent doing other things for health, like restricting calories or increasing intake of fruits and vegetables, exercising, or not smoking. Now, secondly, sodium isn't just related to blood pressure. The body requires sodium for other things, so perhaps a low sodium intake is not a good thing, even if it does reduce blood pressure. Not everything is about blood pressure. So the results of a recent analysis from the Pure investigators, and this is a massive global observational study, published in The Lancet, challenges the current dogma of sodium restriction. And the authors first confirmed that there is indeed a positive association between sodium intake and blood pressure, meaning the more sodium means higher blood pressure. And this was especially true in communities that had higher sodium intake. But they also found that sodium intake was associated with an increased risk of stroke, but only among communities with super high sodium intake, and most of these were in China. However, for MI and mortality, sodium intake was inversely related. Now, don't gloss over this. This means that low sodium intake, restricting sodium, associated with worse outcomes. The authors also found that increasing potassium intake was good. More potassium intake associated with better cardiovascular outcomes. Now, this is observational data, but the clinical impact of these findings are that perhaps if you target communities with a super high sodium intake, you could reduce stroke, and that targeting rather than blanket recommendations would be good for lots of reasons. Not only because it avoids needless distraction of patients' efforts and or waste of resources, but also think about it. If the findings on low sodium intake and increased MI and death are real, you would avoid making harmful recommendations. The other obvious effect I see is that it makes sense to recommend increasing potassium intake via fruits and vegetables. But of course, the inverse relationship here on sodium intake will provoke controversy, and the authors spent a good amount of time in their discussion citing previous studies that also find these kinds of associations. The other strength of this observational study is that they used urine collections to assess sodium intake, not food questionnaires, which everybody knows are flawed. The accompanying editorial is excellent, and it tries to quell debate in this salt debate, but I think the editorialists side with the Pure authors. And one thing that they wrote, and it struck me, was that they point out that the average lifespan of women in Hong Kong is a remarkable 87 years, and this occurs despite sodium intakes on average of 8 to 9 grams per day. That's crazy. The other thing I learned from this excellent editorial was that there's a possibility that there may be a massive RCT in federal prisons looking at sodium intake. And of course, this is a great place to study this because the problem with nutrition studies is that there's so many confounding variables. And if you study sodium intake in prisons, you can at least control more of these confounding variables. Next topic is about value and cost. Now, of course, clinicians must put their patients first. That's our oath. But this doesn't mean we can ignore value and cost. It may not even be comfortable talking about cost, but it's necessary. And I also know that necessary is a strong word, but a clinician who ignores value ultimately hurts his or her ability to help people. There's not an endless supply of dollars. So this week, our news team covered a complicated cost analysis of cardiac drugs that was published in the journal Health Affairs. I'm glad we covered this because it gives me a chance to talk about one of my favorite concepts, and that is low and high value care. The authors in this paper wanted to know whether drug prices in the U.S. are influenced by value. So they estimated cost to efficacy for 30 cardiac drugs that are commonly used, and they used evidence from RCTs to determine the quality of life years gained over the incremental cost to efficacy ratio. Now, they felt that if there was an implicit value threshold based on drug prices and evidence, that they would find a cluster of drugs at or below that threshold. But that is not what they found, and it's little surprise to U.S. docs. In fact, they found that the incremental cost-efficacy ratios in their analysis spanned a spectrum of values, less costly and more effective to more costly and less effective. In other words, drug pricing is not consistently influenced by value in the U.S. The other thing that I liked about this paper is that the authors make cautious conclusions. They call for a debate on how to define and use value-based evidence to inform coverage and decision-making. Now, the methods of their paper are complex, and there are obvious limitations which they wrote about, but I think clinicians should think more about value. As medicine advances, and many of these advances are painfully incremental or costly, we need to have the discussion on where that line of value threshold gets drawn. And of course, that the insurance company pays for something isn't a reason to forget about value. Finally, even though we are doctors, clinicians, and not policymakers, we would do well to think about what we are ordering is on the steep part of the curve, in other words, lots of benefit at low cost, say taking a good history, or is it on the flat part of the curve, say a cardiac MRI before a simple AF ablation, or a PET stress in an elderly patient with dementia. Next topic is about Takotsubo syndrome. Now, 22 years I've been doing clinical cardiology, and Takotsubo's still perplexes me. Why does it happen? Why the female predominance? And why does it seem like we are seeing more of this? There's so many questions. So a report from a large TTS, or Takotsubo syndrome registry, published in JACC, sheds light on the prognosis of this problem. The author's first major finding was that TTS had a similar long-term prognosis compared with age and gender-matched patients with ACS. Their second finding was that among the 1,600 patients in this registry, they discovered an emotional trigger was noted in 30% of patients, a physical stress trigger, say an acute neurodisorder, a medical condition, or extreme exercise, was noted in 39%. And the other 30% had no obvious trigger. And those with a TTS related to emotional triggers had a more favorable prognosis, while TTS due to a neurodisorder had the worst short-term prognosis. And I highlight this paper because it teaches us that the TTS, or Takotsubo, is actually a heterogeneous disorder, and while some forms of it may have a benign prognosis, others do not. And that patients with worse prognosis may warrant more attention, say a longer hospital stay. In fact, that's one of my pro tricks with this condition. I try to find reasons to delay discharge as long as possible, thinking that if I keep patients in the hospital through the acute phase, we may be able to handle or see some of these ventricular arrhythmias that could occur early. Next topic is about carbohydrate intake. So this year in nutrition has been sort of crazy. Last August, we had the PURE results that were presented at ESC, and this showed that diets that were high in fat, even saturated fat, associated with improved mortality. And that same observational study also found higher hazard ratios for death in diets that were rich in carbohydrates. So fats are good, carbs are bad kind of narrative. Well, then in the summer came the Predimed retraction, and that knocked back the pro-fat camp a little bit. Although, to be fair, the Predimed rewrite upheld the results of the original paper, which showed that the Mediterranean diet reduced cardiovascular outcomes, specifically stroke. Well, now we have research recently from the longitudinal study called Atherosclerosis Risk in Communities, or ERIC study. And this was published in Lancet Public Health, and the authors found, very similar to PURE, that a high carbohydrate diet associated with increased mortality. But their key finding was that they found a U-shaped curve with low carb intake. In other words, low carbohydrate intakes associated with higher mortality. And they corroborated this data with other studies in a meta-analysis. But then they went one further step. It's interesting. They found that the association of low carb intake was actually nuanced. Those who ate low carbs and replaced their energy source with animal proteins and fat had increased risk of mortality, while the low carb folks who replaced energy sources with plant-derived protein had lower mortality. So the different aspect of this analysis was that the authors treated carb intake as a continuous variable rather than just breaking it down into quartiles or quintiles. And this, they write, better allowed them to explore the U-shaped curve of mortality. So if you look at figure 3 in the Lancet paper, it shows how their findings are quite similar to Pure when you're looking at the right side of the curve, or the high carbohydrate intake. The mortality curves of the two studies just look the same: high carbs, worse mortality. But then the left side of this figure is where Pure seems to truncate their data at carbohydrate intake less than 40%, whereas the ERIC investigators show that the lower the carb intake goes, the higher the mortality hazard ratio, like a really well-formed U-shape. So wait, what am I actually saying here? Could it be that just moderation of carb intake is what's best? I'll take a look at our news story on this. It's a great piece. Also, keep an eye out for the ESC coming up next week, as the Pure investigators will be there presenting another analysis on quality of diet. And speaking of ESC, I leave today for Munich, Germany to attend ESC. We have both a news preview from our veteran journalist Steve Stiles, and I also wrote an ESC preview that's in the features section. My take of this year's meeting is that it's going to be one for the clinician. There's going to be many studies that address real-world problems faced by people who see patients. One of the ones that I'm looking most forward to is a randomized controlled trial of early versus deferred invasive strategy for patients with acute coronary syndrome. We're going to hear more studies on aspirin for primary prevention, and that's been in the news lately. We're going to hear about the quality of diet and outcomes. We're going to hear about prevention and treatment of VTE and pulmonary embolism, TAVR durability, a report on gout drug safety, and of course, more studies on dual antiplatelet regimens. Look for our coverage. We're going to be on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and of course, you can follow our website at theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology. So that's it for This Week in Cardiology. I'm grateful that you listened. Thank you. We'll be talking to you from Munich, Germany very soon.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.